Hey guys, Wolvie here and welcome back to the channel. As always, the usual disclaimer, any opinion here is mine and mine alone. Now this is RWBY Volume 9, Chapter number 7, and the title of this particular episode is The Perils of Paper Houses. And they, like the previous chapter, I want to say maybe a few other chapters in this volume, just have some format of a warning like before the episode begins, so just a bit of a disclaimer in that on that as well. And with that, we're just gonna go over the usual, the main points from the episode itself, varying factors within, alongside my overall opinion on the episode itself, in the sense of who wrote it, so on and so forth. So we are going to jump straight in. However, before I do, I will mention here a few things. First and foremost, you notice in the background, I no longer have the RWBY poster behind it. And for people wondering why, I am in the midst of some major spring cleaning. I'm just reorganizing a lot of stuff. Most of you may not be aware, I am anticipating some artwork from England for quite some time. So the day that shows up, I do need to make room for some newer stuff, so for when that shows up. So there's a bit of a heads up on that. Also, there's gonna be this is gonna be multiple recording sessions, in the sense of like this part, may see at night right now that I'm filming. The other parts will be filmed probably within the next day or two, so that way everything is cohesive in that regard. Another thing, and there was one other part I want to mention here in a little bit regarding a part that I want to do in this video, but I'm going to save it for the Bumblebee opinion video because it's a little bit more relevant there than in this here. So with that, we're going to jump into certain aspects between chapter 6 and 7, because we do know that Bumblebee is now canon, and what's been revealed via social media by a Volume 9 animator is that Yang's sexuality is in fact pansexual. So that's one of those things where it's there's certain aspects of that I will be going into in the Bumblebee video, because that way it's a little bit more relevant to that sort of thing as opposed to chapter this volume at this point. Now, as I said before, I do want to mention here that yes, this is going to be multiple recording sessions, because this particular episode, there is a lot to unpack here. And when I mean a lot. Now, for episode length, it's pretty much the average for this entire volume so far, up to this point. So it's kind of short, but what else do you expect from Rooster Teeth and RWBY, where the episodes are generally pretty short in length. It's it leaves a lot of room for open-ended ideologies and theories, all that stuff, so it's pretty much on par there. Miles was the one who actually wrote this particular episode, and when it comes to the episodes of Volume 9 so far, or chapters, however you want to put it, this was by far the best. It's you guys get to see certain things in the aftermath of other things. That's that whole shtick. So first things first here regarding this, where we are at in this particular episode, is that the village that Team RWBY and Jaune show up on with Little is the residents are made out of paper, paper houses, all that stuff. So it's pretty much in line with Jaune's house as well. And then, Jaune, he wakes up late, and then there's another thing with Yang snoring. So it's one of those things, it's and I know the whole thing with Yang snoring is it's something we never hear, as far as I know, in the earlier content, but it's and we do know the whole thing with Yang snoring is more like a fan fiction thing, so it makes me kind of wonder, are the writers incorporating fan fiction tales into the latest stuff here? And I'm going to go and get into my opinion on that aspect later on this video, so stay tuned for when I get around to recording that part. So, that sort of thing. So, it's there's fires, all that stuff, which is potential hints of the Joan of Arc death, which is being burned alive, burned at the stake, that sort of thing. And then the whole thing with the Joan of Arc aspect, it's she was like put to death because of heresy and was like she was rejecting church authority over in which she favored direct inspiration from God. In which I feel at varying points in this particular chapter, Jaune is more on that path to getting that type of death. And Joan of Arc is a real life individual, and her time frame was actually the Middle Ages, Dark Ages, right before the Renaissance began. So the whole thing with the varying hints, with Jaune's actions and what he's saying throughout the entire episode, he's going to be a dead man, like I said. If it's not at the end of Volume 9, it's probably going to be one of those items where it's like a post-volume confirmation by the writing team. And we do know that Miles, he has left Rooster Teeth. He's doing independent contract work, so it's like that sort of thing right there. And then also a key portion to take it into account here for this particular chapter is that more information on both the Great Tree and Jaune, his overall state is revealed. And you're looking, now the team is starting to look at it like, we don't know who to believe anymore. Because you have Jaune, he's not telling the entire story. He's omitted and fabricated some things. Then you have the Curious Cat. Same thing. It's like, there's not some stuff here and there, but it's like also at the same time, it's like, if you remember in chapter 6, the Curious Cat retaliated Yang's thing was like, you never asked, you assumed. Which I will address, that whole connection between the end of the chapter and that whole line with Curious Cat a little later on this video. So, that's that bit on that, and then the whole thing with Little is realizing that RWBY is about to be at her breaking point. And I'm referring to the earlier part of the episode, not at the end. So Little's really starting to look at RWBY as like she's at her breaking point. And I think it's a matter of time before she snaps. Now, the whole thing with Neo is like she somehow and easily finds RWBY. And there's a pretty stellar fight there. Now, the whole thing with the aftermath of that fight, and I'm going to get into the certain aspects of the whole thing with RWBY's perspective. RWBY was nearly killed by a walker. Could have been Neo that nearly killed her. And something within that fight really had me thinking. RWBY was given the images of certain individuals, Penny, Cinder, and Salem. It's like, and RWBY, the fact that she didn't even fight, she didn't even help anybody out, and she nearly died in the end of that. But she was given 3 images, and I think that's the thing that helped RWBY snap. So, with the fact that, she nearly dies, and then the team's realizing, okay, we've been ignoring certain things. And so they helped, get the walker off of RWBY, and then only to find out the village that Jaune was in got destroyed. So it's like, they're too distracted. So, it's a bit of its own unique symbolism right there, which I will get into my opinion on that later on. So, with all of that out of the way, all the aftermath of that entire fight, RWBY snaps at everybody. Now, granted, what RWBY and Jaune say to each other is quite out of line, but you have to think about it from their perspective as leaders of their respective teams. Because you have that type of burden, but it's also like some of the people around them are so focused on other things. It's like they are just as to blame for the failures from the leaders and their teams as the leaders themselves. They are just to blame because it's like, if you're trying to do your own thing and you're not like looking at everybody else on your team and you're not looking at your lead, it's like, there's a saying that I tend to think about, I try to live by when I'm with my real life work, is that a team is only as good as the weakest link. And this could mean RWBY was really the weakest link this entire time. It also could mean that somebody on Team RWBY has been the weakest link, and it's just, we really haven't seen, like, who it is and why. So it's one of those things, it's like, that sort of thing is like, okay, who's been the weakest link? What's been our problem? And why did it take this long for RWBY to snap at her team? In addition, why did Jaune feel the need to snap at RWBY, although certain circumstances that led Team RWBY and Jaune even kneel to get into Ever After was on Jaune himself? So, certain aspects, Jaune being Captain Obvious, but again, like I just said, he's not even aware, he doesn't realize that their situation is also on him to an extent. Because there's certain things from previous volumes and moments where he even played a role in it. And it's something Jaune should have realized, but it's like, too little, too late. And I do feel that little symbolism, in a sense, it's like, so the actions, from the rest of Team RWBY, Weiss, Blake, and Yang more so than Weiss, you look at Jaune, it's like, the fact that by the time that you know what's going on with RWBY, it's too little, too late. It's like, Little's trying to tell him, you guys need to be looking after each other. You can't be doing the same old song and dance. So that's what I feel the little symbolism is. It's like, telling the team, you guys really shouldn't be as concerned about each other, in a sense of like, in the case of Blake and Yang, you shouldn't be too concerned about each other only if you have other team members that might be in distress. And as Weiss, it's like, you can't be looking out for yourself if your friend is in need of somebody to talk to. And then the whole thing with Jaune, it's like, he needs to move on. And it looks like he has yet to. Still. So I'm going to check the time here because, like I said, it's going to be multiple recording sessions because, again, it's like, this is a lot to unpack here. Now, the whole thing we do know at the end of this particular episode, RWBY bolts off. She takes Chris and Rose with her. Little goes with her. But we do see that Weiss was the only one who reached out. Even though it was like kind of half-assed in a sense. But Weiss was the only one who made the effort to reach out. While Yang and Blake, arms to their sides, not really doing a thing. And Jaune, he had his back turned on the team. Which could very well hint at Jaune being a villain here. It's not just Neo, but also Jaune. So, the short version of the opinion here is that when it comes down to RWBY stabbing at the team and even Jaune, it was long overdue. Because there are hints from the very beginning of the show where it may not be obvious, it's quite subtle. But it is enough for the team to really see. It's like, we've been ignoring RWBY this entire time, right? By the fact that we've been ignoring her for so long, I think a part of us feels that we deserve that. Although Weiss is like not as much as the rest of them. And when it comes to, like, in this particular portion, it's going to be, like, certain predictions for, like, the remaining 3 chapters. So, when it comes to Chapter 8, it's like, it's been hinted on social media, particularly Twitter, that Chapter 8 is going to be just as bad, in the sense of, like, certain situations. When it comes down, but it's probably going to come down to, potential crossroads with RWBY and or Neo, alongside the remaining of the team plus Jaune, to see they feel like finding RWBY. And the fact that the way that RWBY looked at Jaune, I think it's matter of she figured out the remainder of Weiss's story from the beginning of Volume 9, because Weiss told her exactly, like, as much as she could about what happened to Penny, without breaking down. So this is one of those things is where when it comes down to why it's not omitting certain aspects of what happened, it's actually, I'm on Weiss's side on this, because it's like, certain aspects of information when you talk about somebody who died for whatever reason, whether it be natural causes, homicide, whatever have you. Certain aspects of like what happened to somebody when they die, it's always going to be difficult for somebody to get certain aspects of it out. And I speak on this from personal experience, because when it comes to my mother's death, she died 2 years ago this month. Some aspects of it is like, it's really hard for me to get everything about it out. When it came to Jason David Frank from the Power Rangers franchise, that sort of thing, when he died last November, it's one of those things where it's like, it's hard for me to talk about. So when it comes down to a death of somebody that is close to you, it's going to be really hard to talk about. Sometimes it's, you never get to really fully process it. And I can assure you when I say this, you will never be the same person again. So, and which is why the way RWBY looked at Jaune at the end of this particular episode, it's like, she knows Jaune had a much bigger role in Penny's death than Jaune cares to admit. And I think something tells me that in the coming chapters, the remaining chapters of this volume, RWBY is going to tell Neo about Jaune because Neo gave her some hints. And she's working with the devil. And I think RWBY is going to be the one that convinces Neo to kill Jaune, because Neo can transfer into any person. And we've seen in the beginning of Volume 9 that Neo can transform into Yang. And Yang has her semblance of evolving the element of fire. So it's one of those things is where RWBY does a bit of a double cross. And the reason why I feel she's going to be doing a double cross is like she double crosses a team by working with Neo to kill Jaune, but when it comes down to the tree visiting RWBY, RWBY sacrifices Neo to get herself and the team home. And if she does that, that's going to become like a pretty like intense move, if that makes any sense. So I'm going to check the time one last time here, because that way, because of the app, I want to make sure everybody reminds you, I do this every video. If I'm using the app that I'm using to record this, I do have a 35-minute limit on here. So if I check the time here on occasion, that's why it's a limit, because I tried to film some other videos in one go. It turns out that it's cut off at around the 35-minute mark. So it's like, I have to do multiple recording sessions in order to get the entire thought process behind the video across, where I can use another app to combine the other video, all the videos into one. Granted, it's going to be a long video, but with this particular episode, it is one of those where it's warranted additional filming sessions. And because it's just too long. It's going to be beyond 35 minutes. And there would not be much of a video if you don't see Sandy there. So I'm going to check it one final time for sure. So it looks like I'm on a decent schedule here with this particular portion. But like I said, it's going to be multiple sessions. And that is mainly because the app I'm using, it's about a 35-minute limit. But also there's a lot to unpack here, because again, this is a Miles Luna episode in sense of who wrote it. And when it comes down to the Volume 9 thus far, this is perhaps the best one. This is one where the performances were on point. And this is coming from someone who's becoming more critical of the show in the sense of the writing and the execution of just about everything. And for everybody who thinks it's not okay to have an opinion like this, to become more critical, it comes down to what you're willing to accept, what are you willing to question, and do you want things to improve to where it's people can understand it you get more people to watch it as opposed to accepting things as it is and there's no changes made, and then you have more people leaving. You have less of a smaller audience. And when it comes down to volume 10, that's going to be a completely separate video, because I do feel that if people start leaving after this volume, I would not, I mean, this is a bit of a brief hint of what I'm going to be saying in that video. I would not be surprised if Rooster Teeth decides to do something in some format of crowdfunding in order to release volume 10 like on its own right with Crunchyroll. And the whole thing with Crunchyroll, again, that's separate video about volume 10. So I'm going to stop this video for right now because again, it's a 35-minute limit. However, you're talking about a chapter with a lot to unpack. So when I come back, it's going to be each of these four, and the entirety of Team RWBY plus Jaune, in a sense of what role did they play in RWBY snapping at the end? Because again, that's something that needs to be explored. And again, each team member alongside Jaune is at fault. So I will be back. I'm back. There's a lot of things I had to get done, before I go into this portion of the video. So we're going to go over each individual and what role they played in RWBY's breakdown at the end of Chapter 7, Volume 9. Yes, I'm going to be including RWBY herself because she's not perfect. And we're going to start off with RWBY. Now, there have been varying instances where it comes down to not only her own words, her own actions, but also in how people interpret certain things. Well, some people mention, RWBY's like the worst little sister because there are times where Yang's being more supportive than they think, but it's the jury is honestly out. Now, the whole thing in Volume 4 where RWBY was left Yang, so that way she could join Crow, Nora, Ren, and Jaune, to get to Mistral about the whole relic aspect and find answers. It's some people say, she abandoned Yang, RWBY abandoned Yang, but in reality, RWBY was giving Yang space because Yang was nowhere near her usual cheery self. And sometimes you have to give people space in order for them to sort things out. They don't take things out on the wrong person. So that is that on that. Now, I don't really know in the sense of other instances. However, I could think of, a few times where it's RWBY choosing, let's weigh it out before we know what's really going on. Now, that one could go either way because it's RWBY's not listening to certain objections, all that stuff. But it's also can you really blame RWBY? Her age, the fact that she's a team leader, despite that she's younger than the rest of her team. And then the whole aspect, Volume 7, the sense of the early bit where it's she wanted to explore Alice, just see what Alice has to offer, that's the only time where I can, see, RWBY being in the wrong. But outside of that, there's not really much on RWBY in the sense of her bursting out on her own will that way. But there are, like I said, there are instances where it's throughout the entire show where it's maybe, but it's too tough to call. The jury's out on that one. However, Blake, Weiss, and Yang, alongside Jaune, have bigger roles in it is pretty obvious. Now, there are people who are Yang fans on Twitter who are saying Yang's not really to blame. RWBY went too far, but unfortunately, the writing's on the wall, and Yang does share at least a decent amount of blame. Now, with that bit out of the way, when it comes to the other four characters, Jaune, Blake, Weiss, and Yang, what role did they really play? And where did it all begin? We're going to start off with Blake Belladonna herself. Now, you have to pay very close attention to the dialogue between Blake, Yang, and RWBY in Volume 1, Chapter 3. Now, the reason why you have to pay very close attention is because when it comes down to the book that Blake was reading, RWBY was like was into reading books, all that stuff. And it was around this particular dialogue where Blake was questioning RWBY's reason to be a huntress. Which, ironically, Yang chose to ignore. She used to ignore Blake's questioning RWBY of the reason to be a huntress. Which is surprisingly out of character for Yang in the sense of like defending a family member over a complete stranger at this moment in the show. Super early. They have not yet to go through that initiation. But Yang choosing to ignore Blake's questioning RWBY of why one wants to be a huntress, it's like, that is, in a way, out of character. Now, with Weiss herself, this is one of those where, yeah, she does have a role in this one, but between the four, she actually has the smallest role. Now, what role did Weiss play? It's in the same volume, Volume 1. But it's in that two-parter, Badge and the Burden. Now, what Weiss did was question RWBY's abilities. Now, she slightly done so in Chapter 8 of Volume 1, but she really went for it in Chapters 9 and 10. However, between the four, Weiss owned up to her fuck up fast. And we have seen ever since the end of the Badge of the Burden two-parter, Weiss has proven to be loyal to RWBY beyond the call. And if you see here, in this particular image, that Weiss was the one that's not only the most surprised, but she was also the most saddened. And between the three, here, Weiss was the only one who really reached out. Meaning that the team's really not on the same page. Now, the whole thing with Weiss questioning RWBY's abilities, Yang, like before, chose to ignore it. Which means Yang's reason to be a huntress really does differ than RWBY's reason differing than Blake's reasoning and even Weiss's. But again, you're talking the second instance in the first volume where Yang chose to ignore the times where RWBY is being questioned. Which, in a sense, is very heartbreaking. Now, I'm going to get to Yang in a little bit because she does question RWBY, but I'm going to get to Jaune right now. Now, Jaune's role. Now, the thing is like although he didn't question RWBY, his role is like a bit of a surprise. And by that, omission and fabricating information. Now, this does come up at first in the first volume. In the Jaundice two-parter. Now, the reason why this does come to light is that in the Jaundice two-parter, it's found out that Jaune not only omitted information, but also fabricated information to get into Beacon. Now, this sort of behavior repeats itself in Volume 9 after the team finds him. Now, when it comes to fabrication and omitting information, now, the jury is definitely out on Weiss's role in this whole thing, but you have to understand the thing with Weiss. You can only reveal certain information about certain things without breaking down and crying. When it comes to Penny's death, Weiss revealed what she was able to recall. But you could tell in the tone that Weiss had a very difficult time doing so. And Weiss's decision to make sure she told the entire team everything she knew about Penny's death, it's just that Weiss made the right call, telling what she was able to. And she was a lot more honest about it than Jaune was. So Jaune omitted the fact in Volume 9 that he had a bigger role in Penny's death. And it was Neo who kind of like showed RWBY through like the whole like glimpses of certain aspects that led to Penny's death, which was kind of bold of Neo to do. So it's one of those things. It's like the fact that Jaune omitted his role in Penny's death was really heartbreaking. And the fact that he may very much have lied about certain things, like in the Ever After, may see RWBY turning and or Team RWBY eventually turning against Jaune. And I mentioned this part right now is because in various aspects of the intro, there are way more instances where Team RWBY, it's like it's just the four of them without Jaune. Now, what about Yang? Now, it comes down to the very beginning of Volume 8. The reason why this is very important is because you have to remember, Blake and Weiss already questioned RWBY on a couple of key aspects. When Yang questioned RWBY's decision-making, that was pretty much the straw that broke the camel's back, or however the saying goes. And the fact that Yang chose the beginning of Chapter 8 to question that really caused a divide in the team. Where you saw most of the volume being like Yang being away from everybody else. And then you also notice that Ren kind of had a bit of an argument with her too. So it's one of those things where it's like, does Yang really know what she wants? In the sense of like, who can be a good leader? Who can make consistent, good decisions more often than not? And the fact that she chose a really bad time to question RWBY's abilities, it's like, it showed a very major hint of a strain, not so much with the team, but between Yang and RWBY and their relationship as sisters. Because it's like, Yang waited this long, and by this long, the beginning of Volume 8, to question RWBY. Now, it looks like at least one of the other two team members, either Blake and or Weiss, were like, what the fuck? And I could tell that, they're not really, and at that moment, it's like, come on, this is not a good time to do that. And by Yang picking the worst time to question RWBY's abilities, it's like, yeah. So, with that bit out of the way, I do feel that RWBY was in the right to call all of them out. Because you have to think about it. She was widely ignored in all of Volume 9 up to this point. Because if you think about certain actions from the remainder of the team and Jaune to a degree, is that Blake and Yang were being more concerned about each other than RWBY and Weiss put together. And then the whole thing with Jaune, he kind of like, oh, we're going to the movies, where Weiss tags along with them. It's like, it was RWBY ignored since Volume 7 and no one decided to pay attention until it was too late? And it's like, I don't blame RWBY for anything. And the way RWBY looks at Jaune here, I'm using from RWBY's perspective, is like, she is furious at Jaune because the images that Neo provided her pertaining to Penny's death shows that RWBY is pissed off at Jaune because he omitted the fact that he's the one who killed Penny at her request. He omitted that fact. Now, Weiss, like I said, I side with Weiss's explanation, because it's like, she told everything she was able to without breaking down. Because it was a hard pill for her to swallow as well. So between these four, who played the biggest role in RWBY snapping at last? Who played the smallest role? Now, the smallest role I'm going to go with first because it's very absolutely obvious. And that is Weiss. The reason why Weiss played the smallest role here, no pun intended on her height, is because, here's the thing, she questioned her abilities, but Weiss was quick to correct herself, and she's proven her loyalty to RWBY beyond the call. Weiss, in addition, was the only one who like really was like the closest thing to checking on RWBY outside of Little, which you could explain Weiss's reaction when RWBY left. And she was the only one between the three to have tried to reach out to RWBY. As you can see here. And I'm trying not to scratch my nose, so that's why I had to do that gesture just now. So I'm trying not to scratch my nose. But anyway, Weiss has the smallest role to play in RWBY's sudden departure at the end of the chapter. Again, she fucked up back in Volume 1, but she owned up to the fuck up. And then, when certain aspects since reuniting with RWBY in Volume 5, it's just like RWBY and Weiss was like really good friends, sisters, like someone, they can rely on. And the thing is with RWBY and Weiss, it's like they have that common ground of being the younger sister in their respective families. Because granted, Yang and RWBY are actually half-sisters, but it's still the same. RWBY's the younger sister. Then with Weiss, she has her older sister, Winter. So that common, it's like this, having that type of common ground is like, make their bond a lot more special as sisters and as friends. Now, with that bit out of the way, Yang actually has the biggest role. Let me see if I can get this in my thingamajig. Now, the reason why Yang has the biggest role in RWBY's breakdown is because Yang has ignored RWBY so many times since the very beginning of the show. Like, Yang's expectations for RWBY differed from what RWBY wanted for herself. Because you have to remember the very first episode. Yang was like, RWBY's going to be the talk of the town. Talk of the Olive Remnant. Being the bee's knees. With RWBY's response being, I just want to be a normal girl with normal knees. Something Weiss agreed with. Because Weiss understood that unlike Yang, Weiss understood that RWBY didn't want the attention. She just wanted to do the right thing for the right reasons. And that's something that Yang never really saw. But again, that's the very beginning. Then the very beginning of the following episode, the second episode, RWBY momentarily ditches her because her friend showed up. Seriously? And then, in the third chapter was like, again, RWBY was like, you freaking ditched me because of your buddies. So you're talking about the first 3 episodes of all of RWBY where it's like, Yang and RWBY are not on the same page. And that's like the whole MO between the two. They're more different than they're not. And it looks like there was the super subtle hint of the strain happening. The whole thing in Volume 4, Yang pretty much asked Weiss, Yang very much asked RWBY, say, hey, leave me alone, da-da-da-da-da. RWBY gave her space. But it looks like it wasn't RWBY gave Yang her space, but I don't think Yang really reciprocated that when they all reunited at last. And then another thing here that to keep in mind, and it does involve Weiss to an extent, is like when it comes to hugs and all that stuff, Yang was a more hesitant when it comes to hugging Weiss than people think. Now, the reason why I bring this up is you look at the hug in Volume 5, Chapter 4, Yang was surprisingly hesitant about hugging Weiss back. Surprisingly. And then that whole repetitive motion in the sense of that whole hesitancy with hugging Weiss in Chapter 6 of Volume 5, and then you had that reunion hug late in Volume 8. It's like it doesn't seem sincere, and RWBY is pretty much being affected by the whole thing. There are unresolved tensions between Weiss and Yang. So it's one of those things where it's it's like Weiss is more like a real family member and a friend to RWBY than like Yang. That's just how I'm seeing it. Blake, however, does have a bit of an honorable mention. But it's like she's not really like has the biggest impact or the least impact. But it's one of those things where it's like she has an honorable mention in both regards because it's like she really is like really hasn't done much, and the lack of dialogue between RWBY and Blake, it's just like it's one of those things. It's like they really it's like is Blake really the weakest link? And the whole thing with Blake possibly being the weakest link, it's like RWBY and Blake only really fought together, like their own combination one time, and that was in Volume 8. And that was a near defeat. And it's like, but again, the whole thing with that lack of like interaction between Blake and RWBY, it's like, it kind of proves the whole point back in Volume 7, where it's like, they got to start working on other combinations instead of sticking to what they know. And that's because they are always sticking to what they know. It's like, that's how the team is falling apart. Now, we have seen a little checkmate / monochrome like fighting between Weiss and Blake. And maybe bits of freezer burn with Weiss and Yang. But nothing really outside the Volume 8 fight between Blake and RWBY, which resulted in a near defeat. And then we've never really seen a proper strawberry sunrise between Yang and RWBY. Which means it's like their unwillingness, to do different combinations is really what's starting to hurt them. And I do want to say there's like when it comes to like the checkmate and the Bumblebee like attack combinations, it's like that seems to be working pretty damn good. But the fact that Yang never really worked with RWBY. Outside of the whole trailer for Volume 5. And it's one of those things where it's like Yang has a lot of work to do. And before I finish up this particular part of the whole reveal thing, because there's probably going to be a third part, and it's probably going to be the next day or so, there was one additional item that I wanted to include in this video. But it's like the whole thing with Yang being pansexual. However, it's one of those things I'm going to reserve for the Bumblebee opinion video, because it's like there's a lot of things I want to, get correct and sensitive information, and I want to make sure that when I explain the whole idea with pansexuality, is that I want to make sure it's as accurate as possible with correct information, so that way we all can learn together. And some of the information I'm going to be going into regarding pansexuality in that video, I am buddies with somebody who is pansexual, so I'm going to be contacting her over the next few days, or next several days, I should say, to get as much information as I'm able to, so that way I can cross-reference to some of the things I've been looking up. Because with pansexuality with Yang, it's like you're talking about potential polygamy, which everybody was talking about on Twitter. Well, I don't want to say everybody. There were a few people that were mentioning it on Twitter. So, for a recap for this portion right here, Yang has the biggest role in RWBY, snapping. And it was some of the varying hints have been there from the very beginning. Blake is an honorable mention because, again, there was really a lack of interaction between Blake herself and RWBY. And it's kind of hurting the team in the sense of, like, it's exposing one of the team's biggest weaknesses is, like, communication. Trust. Weiss, like I said, she has the smallest role between all four, because Weiss fucked up early on, but really has answered the call beyond ever since. And if you look at some of the varying fights of Volume 6, it's like Weiss was giving RWBY a major hand in what happened at the end in that volume. Regarding Jaune, however, I do feel that the fact that, the dishonesty, the omission that he's done off and on from the start, is going to be one of those things that's going to cause his downfall and death. But when it comes down to that whole thing, yes, I do feel he's going to be a dead man Who's going to be the one that kills him? And will RWBY be somebody that helps spearhead that? And will Neo, and the whole thing with Neo is just like, that's a whole other ballgame. And I'm going to get into Neo in the next portion. I am back, new day, new shirt. Now, I was thinking about doing Jaune to start this particular portion of the video, but I'm thinking about it after all the takes I've done. It's just like, I was going really off tangent. It's just like, I was really getting at a loss for words to certain aspects, but I'm thinking, why not do something on RWBY and do a photo with RWBY, because it does relate to Neo. Now, the whole thing with Neo is just like, I have to give Neo a lot of balls. Because it's just like, it appeared that RWBY was going to die. But Neo was really clever in using certain images. Penny, Cinder, Salem. And the fact that gesture that Neo did after that quote-unquote fight is that I think Neo has additional information for RWBY that certain people have either omitted or lied about. And perhaps the biggest thing here to keep in mind here is that some of the information Neo likely has for RWBY, involves Jaune. Now, this is a very important detail to really look into, is because the fact that she used RWBY as an image for RWBY is like, Jaune withheld additional piece of information from RWBY pertaining to Penny's death. And this is very, very important to note, is because if you look at Jaune throughout the entire show up to this point, we're starting to see that he's been fabricating information before. He's omitted information before. And for Jaune to burst at RWBY for some of his own fuck-ups, it's like, seriously, Jaune? And what I mean here, to be more specific, you have to go back to Volume 1, but the Jaundice two-parter. Now, the reason why this is a very important hint here for Jaune is that it's the way he got into Beacon. It was exposed by members of Team Cardinal. Now, I mentioned Team Cardinal here because there was a reply to one of my comments on Twitter, and the fact that they said Cardin is coming back. You have to really, I really thought about that comment for a while, and I'm like, wait a minute, the Jaundice two-parter, where Jaundice was found out to have lied and omitted information in his application in order to get into Beacon. Meaning that he's kind of like the eyes and hands of the devil. And that whole thing, that aspect, is like I kind of refer to Sin Nombre for that reference. And that is a Spanish movie. And by Spanish, it's like the language used in the movie is Spanish. To be as clear as possible. But Jaune is pretty much the eyes and hands of the devil. Because, again, he lied in his application, omitted information in his application in order to get into Beacon. And then that was exposed in the Jaundice two-parter by Cardin and Team Cardinal. And the fact that the reply in one of my comments on Twitter was like, Cardin is coming back, it's like, it's exposing the fact that Jaune hasn't been the most honest person. And that's something I feel will bite him in the ass in the end. Big time. And when it comes down to the whole thing with that whole hand thing between Nora and Jaune, it's like, I think we're probably going to be seeing a change in leadership in the team remaining with, that involves Nora and Ren. I think Emerald's going to be part of that team. And then it comes down to the, I think it's I'm trying to think about what I'm going to say here, is that the whole thing with Oscar, I think he kind of fills in that, makes up the remainder of that team. 2 men, 2 women, that sort of thing. So I think it's like I said, the whole thing with Jaune's been doing, this entire time, fabricating things, omitting things. It's like, this is what's going to kill him. He's doing like acts of heresy, you know, rejecting certain things in favor of direct inspiration from a higher power. And I think Neo's going to be the one that helps RWBY see that piece of information. But I don't think Jaune's the only one who owes RWBY an explanation. In a way, Yang Xiaolong also owes RWBY an explanation about Tai Yang. Because you have to think about that breakdown RWBY had went through here. Now, and the reason why I'm bringing this up is that you remember Volume 4, Yang has her PTSD. Now, at some point in Volume 4, Tai Yang brushed RWBY off when he was talking to the other professors. Because Tai Yang had bigger issues to worry about. This is something that Yang overhears. That Yang finds out that RWBY went off with the remaining members of Team Juniper alongside Crow. So it's one of those things where it's like Tai Yang has a lot more explaining to do. And Yang's probably going to fill in with whatever she can, but should the team return the remnant, Tai Yang has to fill in the rest. Meaning that Tai Yang told Yang about some information pertaining to Raven, but not Tai Yang himself. And I do feel that Yang also owes RWBY an explanation on certain aspects pertaining to Summer. However, I think Neo's going to be the one that fills in some of that information. But it comes down to what information does RWBY get? How will she react to it? And will Team RWBY be the same again? And to reiterate certain things here and there, in the sense of like blame game, all that stuff, which I think will happen at a good chunk for Chapter 8. There's going to be a lot of that. And then, some degree of finger pointing comes down to who takes the biggest blame. Now, Yang's going to have to start stepping up and realizing she's going to be taking a good chunk of it because she's ignored RWBY so many times when RWBY really needed her the most. And Weiss, I do feel she's going to have the smallest amount of blame because the only time RWBY and Weiss were like at each other's throats was in Volume 1, but we really haven't seen much of that since, outside of maybe the whole thing beginning as Volume 2, which led up to the food fight. But it's like, yeah. But that's the only thing. And then Blake is a bit of like jury's out on this one because it's like Blake and RWBY really never had a chance to interact or hang out. But I do feel that a lot of the blame is going to be on Yang because it's like what Yang chose to ignore. What Yang chose to assume about RWBY. And it's like, this one's on Yang, unfortunately. I mean, granted, you know, the whole thing with the older sister bit, you know, they did all they could, but it's like they got to move on. It's like, not when you're in a situation like Team RWBY is in. And the only one that's really genuinely like worried about RWBY is actually Weiss. If you pay close attention here to Weiss's arm, and specifically her left arm, because it's like she was like trying to reach out to RWBY somehow. Now, what Blake is a bit of a jury still out sort of thing is that her right arm starts to reach out, but not really. But if you look at Yang and why I feel she's going to be taking the most of the blame, is that Yang doesn't even bother to try to reach out. And that's something that Yang has a lot of explaining to do. It's just like she was just shot there at a loss for words. Weiss had a feeling of such on and off in the volume, although Weiss kind of ignored her too. And then Blake was like starting to realize that something wasn't right. Although here it's like you look at the three remaining members, it's like Yang kind of does start, like, does start with the whole thing, but it's mostly her arms were at her sides. It's like, Yang, like I said, she has a lot of explaining to do, but to outdo Yang in this particular instance, Jaune has even more explaining to do to RWBY than Yang. Which is why I feel, when it comes to those 3 remaining members, it's like, yeah, Yang has a big role in this one, in RWBY's outburst, but Jaune has just as big of a role in his own right, because it's like RWBY was the one who lifted him up, and you're talking about somebody like RWBY who was in like a school that led into Beacon. And it's like, although Oz, also saw, Jaune in the same situation like RWBY, Jaune never had any real training. Although Jaune was like good in like telling people what to do. But I think one of Jaune's biggest like issues here is that he still has yet to get over Pyrrha. And that's something he's going to have to do if he were to return to Remnant, which I don't think will happen. But it comes down to the Great Tree, if it makes a visit to RWBY, and it's going to get really interesting for the remaining 3 chapters. Now, with that, predictions for the remaining 3 chapters. Like I said, there is a possibility of a double crossing by RWBY. So she betrays these 4 by going after Jaune with Neo at hand. And then she betrays Neo in the end. So that's one angle. Now another angle would be, RWBY and Neo realize, RWBY and Neo realize it's like, I'm sorry, they somehow find a way to talk it out. And then, Neo switches sides, because you have to remember the 3 images that Neo provided RWBY. Which could very well mean that Neo has additional information that the remainder of the team, minus Weiss, has omitted from her or lied to her about. Because we now know that Jaune's fabricating things has come up again. Although it's like, that's going to be something that the team is probably going to be confronting him about at some point. Now, pertaining to the blame game, it's going to be really interesting to see who takes the most amount of blame, and it's going to be an equal amount. It's maybe an equal amount of Jaune and Yang. Jaune because of the lying and omission of information. Yang because she chose to ignore varying things about RWBY. She assumed so much, and she also assumed certain things pertaining to Weiss with Blake's help. It's like, have we really been thinking things through? Have we been consistent with communication? The answer is a resounding no, and then some. Meaning that they have to work out loud their issues. And I also feel there's going to be some unresolved tension between Weiss and Yang over the matter. And that stems from Volume 5. Meaning that you got some freezer burn moments here for Weiss and Yang, but it feels extremely one-sided first and foremost, and then 2, it's like Yang's like, not as happy to see Weiss as RWBY was. Which means that the whole thing pertaining to the unresolved tensions between Weiss and Yang may see the team falling up for even further apart, because it's like, if you remember from the cover art in Volume 9, we see here the direction where each team member is facing. And to be as specific as possible, you see Blake and Yang are facing each other, which is not the same as RWBY and Weiss. They're facing the viewer. And because the facial sense of direction they're facing, it really does mean that the team is not on the same page. Meaning that you're talking about hesitancy to go back into Remnant because there are things going on in Ever After, as opposed to just going back to Remnant to make things right. And there are some people who have been hinting that we're probably going to see an extended stay in Ever After for Volume 10, but we have to remember we don't know anything about Volume 10. In the sense of, will it get the green light from Warner Brothers? Now, if it does not get the green light from Warner Brothers, and this is a bit of a brief thing for another video I have planned, is that it's going to become really interesting what Rooster Teeth decides to do. But it won't be something I'll be covering on the channel, because it's like, after I do the revisiting for Volume 9, it's just like, I'm going to be done with covering RWBY altogether. So, to reiterate this part right here, it's like, they're not seeing eye to eye as a team. But there is one thing I feel is going to happen. It looks at you look at the intro real carefully. It's like, when she takes off with Little and Crescent Rose, I think there might be a couple of things that could very well happen. It's like, one of them being that RWBY gets a new weapon, and her semblance does have evolved somehow, which helps with the second trial by fire. And we're probably going to be seeing Summer Rose in some dialogue with RWBY, because we know that Yang has a lot of more memories with Summer than RWBY does. When it comes to people dying when somebody was really young, it's like they're not going to remember varying things, because when somebody dies and the child is maybe less than 5 years, maybe give or take, they're not going to remember certain things about that individual. But I do feel we're going to be seeing more Summer, in the sense of Summer's going to be the one that helps get RWBY back to as close to who she used to be, the cheery self, that sort of thing. But again, to reiterate this portion of the video, Jaune and Yang have a lot of the blame here. Granted, in their respective right. For Jaune, he omitted information. He has lied about things. With Yang, however, she chose to ignore RWBY when RWBY needed her support the most. Because it's RWBY got pushed up 2 years to get into Beacon. Jaune had to lie about things. And the fact is who's willing to support who is this is why the team is heading to Splitsville. And when it comes to the end game, the team splits. And there's a particular still, I need to look this up for Volume 8, is where, it's Whitley and Weiss were standing, although they're on opposite sides of the table, but they were both standing. And it's everybody else was seated. Now, some people mention, the pairings being endgame, but if you really think about the whole aspect of the endgame in the sense of who's seated, it's you really don't see Jaune in it. Meaning that he could be a dead man. But also, the fact that Weiss was the only one standing is that she may be the one that breaks away from the team for good. But it's that, but it's not for bad reasons. It's to completely rebuild Alice. Have Alice to be for the people. Alongside Winter and Whitley. Because if you remember Volume 8, Whitley was really starting to redeem himself. In the sense of it's the whole thing with it was his reasoning at first was Nora and all that stuff. But it's when Weiss was giving him that praise, because he knew he had certain ways to do things. It's that really made Whitley feel that he could make a difference for good. He did his best. That's something where it's Whitley, when the team comes back to Remnant, Weiss is going to be telling him the same thing. You did all you could. The same thing that RWBY told Weiss in Volume 9, Chapter 2. So it's one of those things that's the team has to really talk things over. But I honestly feel that Endgame Team RWBY will split, but it's because Weiss is going to be focusing her energy on rebuilding Alice alongside Winter and Whitley. And make sure Alice becomes a place for the people. Like, the new She Does company would be like something that could be run with, where people could be proud of that. Where the actions made things right in fixing Jacques' fuck-ups. So on that, I'm going to do, the final portion will be my overall thoughts on everything and everything I've said up to this point. So it may be a new day, it may be me after work, we'll see. So all in all, what do I think about this particular chapter now? Because this was one written by Miles, this one very much saved Volume 9 on a whole, because up to Chapter 7, a lot of stuff was left a lot to be desired. Because it's like, if it weren't for like varying cliffhangers, it was something else that made it it just left way too much out. And then the majority of the episodes up to this point, it's like they were really short, although it was very restricted to do so. And I wish it would have been, a shorter volume, but the episodes were longer, meaning that you have a lot more information to put in. Now, like I said before, there is a lot of finger pointing to go around. But sometimes one has to ask, where did the breakdown begin? Meaning that RWBY's breakdown. And again, if you really think about certain aspects of the characters that I mentioned earlier, where Blake, she questioned RWBY's reason to be a huntress, Weiss questioning RWBY's abilities as a huntress in training, and Yang questioning RWBY's decision making, where Jaune is like lying and or omitting things. It's like the signs are all there, in a sense of where it all began. That RWBY's breakdown, because with Blake, she was the first person to question RWBY about something. The whole reason to be a huntress, it's like, you have to remember that suggestion Blake came up with Weiss going to Atlas by herself. That way she could get the others in. Blake also assumed that Weiss was also still the heiress of the SDC, when we know that hasn't been the case since Volume 4. When Blake questioned RWBY's reason to be a huntress, Yang chose to ignore it. When Weiss questioned RWBY's ability, in the sense of it's like in the Badge and Burden 2-parter, Yang chose to ignore that. When it comes to John's lying and omitting about things, it's like RWBY may be targeting him and could get Neo's help to do so. With Yang, she chose to, like I said, to repeat, she chose to ignore Blake's questioning of RWBY's reason to be a huntress. Yang chose to ignore Weiss's questioning RWBY's abilities, and Yang herself questioning RWBY's decision making. It's like nobody was really had RWBY's back. And the whole thing with the significance with Little here in this volume so far, it's like their actions are too little, too late. And then Neo, like I said, it's going to be really interesting to see what actually happens, because there's a couple of possibilities between Neo and RWBY for Chapter 8. One of them being RWBY being a double crosser. She betrays Jaune, then Neo. Pretty much that. So that's one possibility, which I'm thinking that's going to happen. And there's another possibility of Neo providing RWBY additional information, which could lead into either way. Either RWBY doing that double crossing, or RWBY and Neo coming to an understanding about each other. Because I'm thinking that Neo is in fact Alex, because if you look at a part of Neo's face, it's the dark hair, the dark eyes. I won't be surprised if Neo is in fact Alex. And the thing is, there's that additional information. And then the whole thing with RWBY, I think we're probably going to be seeing a newer weapon. We're probably going to see RWBY, coming to terms with the whole thing with her mother, Which again, Yang has something explained to do there. And Jaune had something explained to do with his own actions. And with Blake and Weiss, it's like they're the two who are like realizing, yo, we screwed up here. And we know that Weiss was the only one who really was reaching out to RWBY. Now I think when it comes to like the leader thing, McJig, we may see the whole thing with chapter 9 and 10, volume 1, where Weiss decides to step up and be the leader. Because, you know, the thing is with Glyphs, she has a much more reliable way to, like, travel in a sense. She can get people, like, where they need to be. Although if I were to pick somebody who steps up as a leader until everything is all sorted out with RWBY, it's going to be Blake. Because Blake, in my personal opinion, has a lot to prove. I mean, we don't know anything about Blake's past in the sense of, did she have any training prior to Beacon? Because we know that Weiss and Yang have had training prior to Beacon. We don't know that about Blake. Jon Favreau lied about that whole thing. And the unknown comes down to Blake in this case. So I think we're going to be seeing Blake taking a leadership role here. And that's because of the fact that we don't know if she had any training prior to attending Beacon, which is something I don't think we've heard of up to this point. We do know that Jaune has lied about his. Yang and Weiss, however, they have had their training. Although it's like in different methods. So on that, I'm going to check the time here. So this is going to be like the shorter ending of this particular video, but I just want to get that off my chest. So there's going to be a lot of like questions that are going to come around. I do feel that the beginning is going to be a lot of finger pointing, and I do believe a lot of it is going to be directed at Jaune and Yang for their own reasoning. Because Yang was like assuming RWBY's going to be okay without asking, which is something that the Curious Cats, you know, kind of retorted at them for. It's like, you have to remember, like, after the post-Bumblebee kids, it's like, you left certain things out, and then Curious Cat's retort was, you never asked. Is that, which gives us the hint, is that Yang always assumed things. And she never bothered to ask. And again, it comes down to like the things Yang has been ignoring from right out of since like the beginning. And Jaune, you know, the fact that he fabricated all that stuff, it's like that whole thing is going to come back and bite him in the ass. And that's all I have for this particular episode. With Wolvie here signing off, I will catch you all on the flip side.